from the University of Virginia Center for Politics.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming out. At all the events I run, I keep my introductions of our visitors short and sweet. I normally don't have attorneys general of places like the Commonwealth of Virginia, but I'm going to keep up the tradition of short and sweet if no one minds. But first, I'd like to start by thanking the Center for Politics and the Jefferson Council who put this together and asked me if I would like to be the interlocutor for the fireside chat portion of this event. We're delighted to have the Attorney General on campus, and I'm always delighted to cooperate with the two organizations. So thank you, and particularly for Glenn and Ken Stroop, Glenn Crossman. Jason Miyares was raised in Virginia Beach, something I'm happy to say, given my wife also grew up there. He was the son of a refugee from communist Cuba. He attended James Madison, where he was a business student, and then he jumped cleanly over Charlottesville and UVA and attended law school at William and Mary. He then became an assistant Commonwealth's attorney, which is another word for prosecutor, back home in his native Virginia Beach. And there he was involved not only in the law, but in several election campaigns at different levels of office. And in 2015, he was elected under his own steam to the legislature, to Virginia's House of Delegates. And he says that it was almost 50 years to the day, that is, after his mother arrived in the US, that she was able to cast a ballot for him, which is a pretty wonderful summation of something about the American experience and the opportunities available to so many immigrants over time here. He served 3 terms in the legislature before being elected Virginia's 48th Attorney General, in the process becoming the first Hispanic American elected to statewide office in this state. Virginia is one of the 43 states that elect their AG, and as both that fact and his professional experience suggest, he has both law and politics in his blood by now, if he didn't from the get-go. And those are two things, and the intersection of them is a third that we look forward to discussing today. He's going to make some brief remarks to get us going, and then he and I are going to sit down and have a conversation, and then at the end, time for you all to intervene as well with questions. Thanks.
Well, when Professor Alexander invited me to come speak, he said, "Mr. Attorney General, do you believe in free speech?" I said, "Well, of course I do." He said, "Congratulations, you're going to give one." So here I am. And it is a true honor to be here and speak to you. I want to actually not speak to you as an Attorney General, I want to speak to you as an American about some observations that I have, some challenges. Particularly, I'm so thrilled that we have so many young people here who may not realize a little bit of what they're both living through and some of the benefits they have by waking up in this country and breathing the air as a free American. So as mentioned, my mother, Miyares, who she got an airplane literally penniless and homeless and not knowing where her next meal was going to come from when she was 19 years old in Cuba. And her experience of living in a society that denies you of your individual dignity and your freedom is something that left an enormous impression on me as a young child. And you have those memories that stick with you, that stay with you the rest of your life. And one of my earliest memories was my mother coming to my kitchen, our kitchen, and asking me to teach her the Pledge of Allegiance. And I couldn't understand. That was one of those early memories I realized my family's a little different. Why wouldn't you know the pledge? And she had to learn it for a naturalization ceremony. And I got to sit as a 6-year-old boy, not quite grasping how powerful it was, and not quite understanding why my mother was so emotional taking that oath of allegiance to the United States. To this day, as Attorney General, it is my favorite thing to do in the world. I did one last week at Randolph-Macon College, 85 individuals from 55 countries, and I was able to say, it is the honor of my life as your Attorney General to welcome you home. I tell my daughters gratitude is one of the most underrated traits for all human beings. And ingratitude is one of the ugliest. At least for me, I had such gratitude that I was raised here. I want you to ponder this for a second. as we sit in this amazing school with such history, this amazing moment in our history. You are a generation that on paper should be the happiest. Do you realize that? You are the most financially secure generation in American history. You're the most educated generation in American history. You're also the most depressed. On paper, you should be the happiest, but you're the most depressed with the highest levels of depression and anxiety and addiction we've ever seen. And I do think there's something going on in our society of a decoupling of purpose. And so many young people, I think they've lost a little bit of what has made this country such a beacon for so many people that have fled to this country. So as we sit here, where you're sitting right now, ponder this. That there's millions of people on this planet that woke up this morning wishing they could be where you are right now. They would do everything in their power. They would tie inner tubes together and cross a shark-infested waterway. They would hang to the side of an airplane. They would crawl over broken glass to be where you are right now. Somebody woke up this morning on this planet just as smart as you, just as talented as you, with just as many dreams and hopes and aspirations. And they look at a map and they look at the United States and they wish that they could have that opportunity to be here. We think what we have in this country is normal. It is abnormal. It is utterly different than how most people have ever lived their lives in all of humanity. 99% of every human being that has ever lived on this planet Earth did not have the ability of casting a ballot to choose their leader. Do you know that? 99% of every human being that did not live, who has ever lived, did not have freedom of speech or freedom to worship. The way we live our lives is so utterly abnormal compared to how most people who have ever lived on this planet have lived. I was speaking to Mr. Sabato's class earlier, and I pointed out that for most people, even today, who woke up this morning on this planet, if they hear this right here, they hear a knock on the door, it affects them very differently how it affects you. When you hear that, it's a friend coming over to say hello. Maybe your dog got out. I like to joke, it's probably my kids got a hold of my Amazon Prime account, ordered something I didn't know about. But for so many people who woke up this morning on this planet, if they hear this, that's something very, very different. Somebody's there to take them away because they have worshiped God in a manner they disagree with, or because they've spoken up for human rights and human dignity. It's what I call what we have the American miracle. It's been referenced about my family story. It's not that unique. So many of the immigrants that come here, they get to see their children achieve dreams they can only dream of in this country. Particularly when I'm in Southwest Virginia, sometimes people ask me, what kind of name is Miyares anyway? And I like to say, well, it's Southern. It's deep South. But it is a great appreciation for who we are as a people. And so my question for you as college students is, when you look at America, and you should have those great debates and those great discussions about how we could build a more perfect union. But when you do, the question you have to ask is, when you look at America, it is this: compared to what? Compared to what? If you compare us to perfection, we fail, obviously. A government of men, by men, created by men, and by I mean men, I mean both genders, is going to be one with failings, undoubtedly so. But every time that we've achieved both progress and equality in this country, it is because we've appealed to some of our most noble founding fathers' ideals. I've noted before, Margaret Thatcher said that in Europe, all the countries emerged out of history, but America is the only country to emerge out of a philosophy. Or as G.K. Chesterton noted, America is the only country in the history of the world to be founded on a creed. Now, I think the American that best encapsulated that creed was Dr. Martin Luther King and the steps in the Lincoln Memorial. where he said those rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he described that as the promissory note made to every American, past, present, and future. And he was there to collect on that promissory note. Thank God he did. Now, who wrote the promissory note? Come on, I'm at UVA. This should be an easy one, guys. Who wrote the promissory note? Jefferson. He's not a great public speaker, but he was an unbelievable thinker, and he wrote the birth certificate for a nation. And every time that we've made that appeal and those steps throughout our history towards equality, who did we appeal to? Was it Confucius? Was it Rousseau? It was the quiet, unassuming lawyer who founded this very school. Utterly transformational. We're about to enter into 2026, the 250th birthday of America. And those words immortalized in the Declaration of Independence, my hope it will be a celebration. Because whether it is in the gulags of China, Russia, North Korea, or Cuba, those political prisoners know those words. They know that promissory note. My uncle was one of them, Angel Miyares in Cuba. He got arrested at Bay of Pigs. And when he went through a mock execution, do you know what got the jailer so enraged? It's because he told them he had certain inalienable rights that cannot be taken from him, of life and liberty. When you're in America, you don't realize somehow how America is seen by the rest of the world. And for all of our faults, we are indeed a place unlike any other. I did a naturalization ceremony in February in Harrisonburg, and the judge did something utterly remarkable. He handed these new Americans the microphone, and he asked them, "What does this mean to you?" And it was utter gratitude by so many of those new Americans. One woman from India got up and says, "I've lived in 5 other countries. I've never felt as welcome as I have living here." My favorite moment was when an elderly man from Afghanistan got up. And his English was very poor, so he had his son speak in his place, and he'd actually written a letter. And it said, "Dear America, this is the greatest day of my life. I have 2 children that have served in the armed forces, and I have told them that your number 1 job is to make sure that your future children recognize what a remarkable country this is. And if you need a visual reminder, after this, go on YouTube, type in the opening ceremony of the Summer Olympics, Tokyo. Right, we all know what the Parade of Nations is. Right, all the countries walk in, right? You start with Greece, and then you shift, and it goes in alphabetical order: Albania, Botswana, Chile. 119 countries walked into that stadium in Tokyo. And then you get to that amazing moment where they get to us, and they announce us, the delegation from the United States of America, and the doors open. And we walk in and you notice something's very, very different. 119 countries walked into that stadium, but only 1 out of 119 did the delegation actually look like the entire world. Every race, every color, every creed. It's an amazing visual reminder of indeed what President Lincoln said was the last best hope on earth. So that's why you're here. Ultimately, you're here, I hope, to help both preserve and strengthen the last best hope on earth, and to recognize who we are as a people, where we came from, both of our challenges, but also our triumphs. And it is an honor to be here today on this campus for a discussion with what I hope to be future leaders, both in Virginia and our country. Thank you. God bless. I have trouble operating heavy equipment, so hopefully this works.
This may count. I don't want to waste a minute of our time with you, so let me dive right in with a question about one of the major controversies you've faced as Attorney General. Should you have filed a lawsuit on behalf of James Madison's football team?
Yes, and some people may or may not like this, but I also filed a lawsuit against the NCAA because...
I was going to ask about that separately.
Right. Well, whether we like it or not, college athletics is a huge sport. CBS Sports signed a $7 billion contract just to advertise the men's basketball tournament. And the student athletes got zero of that. So if I was a computer science major at VCU, or an Amazon wanted to hire me, or an engineering major at Tech, or I'd written a Grammy award-winning song as a student at Virginia State, I could be rewarded for my talent. That's somewhat the best of America, right? You have a talent, you can be rewarded for it. It's only our student athletes that they have a talent that generate insane amount of revenue for these schools that can't be rewarded for their talent. And some of the impetus, candidly, is I have 2 senior members of my staff that both played college football. And they never sniffed the pros, but their bodies are broken. They have shoulder injuries, back injuries. My attitude is, if you have a 4-year window, you could be rewarded for your talent. I just think that's fundamental fairness. So that's kind of the background of it. I think college athletics is going to respond to it. I'm proud to stand with it, and several states are going to be joining.
This is what the NIL, right? The names,
NIL,
images, and likenesses, right?
Right.
Is your lawsuit in that sense, yours is in conjunction with the state of Tennessee, am I right, or your counterpart in Tennessee?
Tennessee, but New York, well, I should probably be quiet because I don't know if they publicly announced. There's several states that are joining.
And that's not superseded by what I understand to be a bill recently signed by the governor here?
Not superseded at all.
Okay.
No. But that's a good thing because he signed the law allowing the schools to better coordinate with our high school athletes. Okay. And listen, I mean, the reality is college sports is it's a business. It is a multi-billion-dollar business. For years, if a college player accepted so much as a $200 gift to fly mom or dad out to see him play a game, that's an impermissible benefit. But the school could sell their jersey with their name on it, charge $150, and they would get zero. And so I think student empowerment here is a good thing, and we will see where this takes us. But I do think that the NCAA has been in violation of our antitrust laws, and that's kind of the origins of it.
Okay. Well, aside from wisecracks about the Dukes and your suit there, I want to back up to the beginning, because I think this is always of interest. It's interest to all of us, but I think it's particularly of interest to 17 to 22-year-olds who are trying to figure out their own courses of life and career. Can you talk a little bit about how you got into both politics and into office? And let me ask specifically along the way, if you could address, would you be AG today if you had not worked on campaigns, if you had not gained that experience, maybe also particular relationships? So can you talk about a little bit about your getting into this world and this life in this office?
I remember early hearing stories both from my uncle Angel, who I remember when he told me the story of when he got arrested, and I said, I don't understand, how could they do that and not even have a trial? And he kind of patted me on the head and said, you're very naive because you're born in this country, and you have a Bill of Rights, and we have a constitutional liberty, and you can't do that here, but you could do it just 90 miles off our coast. And that's really got me on this interest of, well, why are we different? And really started even at an early age reading. And that kind of got me on that path. I did not come from a political family. Nobody in my family was involved in politics in any way. I mean, they voted, they would talk about current events, but they were not in any way interested or involved in the sense of going involved, even with a local party. They had no interest in it whatsoever. And so starting in college, getting a little bit more active, and then kind of post-college, pre-law, before law school. I mean, I decided the world was in desperate need of another lawyer and went off to law school, but did some campaigns, and that definitely had an impact, I would say. And I would say this is just general advice for every young person here. My father left home when I was in high school, and I have been blessed with some extraordinary individuals in my life that have mentored me, that have been those that I have gone to seek counsel and wisdom about my career. And one of the best pieces of advice I can give a young person is seek out those that have come before you and ask their opinion. Because when you seek their guidance, first of all, they're shocked to hear it. Not many people your age does that, but they also feel invested in you. And I was reading a social scientist who made an observation. He said, there is a phenomenon in Western civilization that you only see in Western Europe and North America. It's the first generation that ignores the wisdom of those that have come before them. By that I mean, if you go to Africa, if you go to Asia, if you go to Latin America, they revere their elders. They revere their wisdom. Because the only thing the age gives you is perspective, right? And I tell my daughters there's two ways to learn from mistakes. Either you make them, or you can talk to somebody who's made them themselves and learn from them. But it's only, candidly, really since kind of the 80s that you have a generation that doesn't think we have anything to learn from those that have come before us. And for whatever reason, I do think it's because of the brokenness of my home, I actually sought that out. And I've had individuals that really both invested and mentored me, telling me I should go to law school, things of that nature. And then even politically, individuals that have invested in me. And they had a huge influence on me. So I'd absolutely say you need to take advantage of that, because candidly, people your age don't ask those many questions anymore. And I think that's been very beneficial. And yes, I do think the fact that I did some campaigns prior to law school, and it's actually where I met my wife, so I'm pretty biased when I say go work in a campaign. I met my wife working on a campaign and been happily married. This is 20 years. This is our 20th in June. So a big fan of, my daughters think that it was the dorkiest way for me to meet mom, but I don't care. But I do think you learn a lot about it, because you learn a lot about politics. It's not the West Wing. That's a TV show. I just dated myself.
They don't know.
They don't know. It's definitely, let me be clear, public service announcement, it is definitely not House of Cards in any way, shape, or form. I had to stop watching that show because I thought, gosh, I know so many good people on both sides of the aisle that they sacrifice so much time away from their family. They deal with a lot, and to have that portray as that's the way politics really is. And I know it's fiction, and they know it's fiction, but I actually had people stopping me saying, well, who's the main guy? Who's the Kevin Spacey character? Whatever that guy is, and I'm like, no, it's nothing like that. And so there is distorted. So by actually working in campaign, you get an idea of how politics is, and there's a lot of good people in it. There's bad actors in it, like any other profession, but there's also a lot of good people trying to do good things. And in today's world, particularly with social media, it makes it an interesting time.
Yeah. An attorney general is the top law enforcement officer. Now, we all know that the law has now, secreted itself into basically every corner of American life. There are legal officers in the military. There's, corporate law of all kinds, intellectual property, names, images, and likeness of athletes become the subject of lawsuits. But the core original task and responsibility is sort of order in a more fundamental sense, which has historically gone by the name of crime. Now, if one thing young people don't know is the West Wing, another is that they've never, until very recently, known what inflation was as a phenomenon. It's just something that had been, squeezed out of modern American life, and therefore their cognizance. And crime is something that since basically the spring and summer of 2020, since the crime wave that it became associated with COVID, in effect, and its aftermath, is something that's obviously come to matter a lot. It's mattered in all kinds of political and social settings. It's led to the recall of a, prosecutor, the top legal official in the state of San Francisco, the city of San Francisco. It's led to a lot of things. And it has also become, in its own way, deeply politicized, most controversially maybe, with prosecutors elected in a number of jurisdictions who, one way of putting it is prosecutors who are committed to not prosecuting at least certain kinds of crimes for a variety of debatable reasons. Have we forgotten the lessons of decades past, or what?
Right.
How do you think about where we find ourselves?
They say the only thing you learn from history is nobody learns from history. So there's nothing being proposed today, nothing. Nothing being proposed today is some new, innovative criminal justice reform that wasn't tried in the 1970s. Cashless bail, tried. Early release of violent offenders, tried. No mandatory minimums, tried. All of this was tried in the 1970s, ladies and gentlemen. All of it. And it led to a crime explosion. Crime explosion. And then there were some reforms that got instituted between 1992 and 2018. Crime dropped every year in this country, including gun violence. Every year dropped in this country between 1992 and 2018. And so what happened? You had truth in sentencing. You had pro-abolition. To give you an idea of what was the regime in Virginia, what was it like prior to the abolition of parole and truth in sentencing in Virginia, the average sentence someone would serve in Virginia was 1/4 of their sentence. So somebody does a violent rape, gets sentenced to 20 years, they'd be out in 4 or 5. Now, study after study has shown that 3 to 5% of felons commit over 50% of violent crime. 3 to 5% of felons commit over 50% of the violent crime. So if you want to lower crime, you have to go after violent repeat offenders. The average arrest rate, the average arrest record of somebody picked up on a homicide charge in Washington, D.C. is 11 prior arrests. 11. Let me do a little test here. If I was to go out right now, I don't assume everybody has a car here. Let's assume you have your car on campus. If I was to go out right now and break in and steal your car, how much time do you think I would serve?
You're saying not the sentence, the actual
What would be my
time served.
sentence?
Yeah.
8 years? 2 years? You're the only one that has it right. 0. That shock everybody here? I would serve 0, because I don't have a record. I would have 0 time, right? I'd probably get sentenced 2 years, all suspended, condition on 2 years of good behavior. And so what happens is penalties start kicking in once you become a repeat offender, right? And so that's something that's often not talked about. And we got away from that. We got away from a lot of these common sense. And so I will tell you this, it is true that there are studies that have shown that a certain level of poverty can produce crime. There's also enormous studies, enormous amount of data that shows crime produces poverty. 2/3 of all new jobs created in America are not created by the Walmarts or the Amazons or the big corporations. 2/3 of all new jobs in America are created by small businesses. Small businesses do not stay in high crime areas and they flee. So I talk to shop owners where they live in jurisdictions where in the name of equity, they don't prosecute larceny-related crimes of $1,500 up to $1,500. They will not prosecute. They've basically legalized theft. They can't keep their doors open. That's why you're having this term food deserts. You heard the term food desert? It's when you can't get fresh fruits and vegetables in a certain mile radius. It's not that there's not a population to serve. It's that they cannot keep their doors open because of the influx of larceny-related crime. So crime also produces poverty. Jobs don't locate there and existing retail leave. And so there's a lot of that that has been forgotten. And I would say this, how many people ever want to either serve in public office or work in government? Raise your hand. A good number of you. I said this at Dr. Sabato's class, and I'll say this to you. One of my greatest frustrations about government, it's only in government where people in government will measure success by their intentions and not their results. Nobody in the private sector could. Can you imagine if you were operating a car company and you rolled out some new horrendously designed vehicle and you lost 50% of your market share and get called in to your boss's office and they say, well, boss, I meant to grow. I meant this to be a big hit. You can't hold me accountable. Can you imagine being in the military and saying, well, why in the world did you charge right up that hill straight to the teeth of the enemy? Well, General, I meant to capture that hill. Or if you're on the football team and you say, well, why did you go for it on 4th and 27? And you get on the sidelines and you say, well, I I called the audible because I meant to get the first down, right? It is only in government. Or maybe they mean well. We don't want to prosecute larceny-related crimes because we want a more equitable justice system. Even if you see the data that says you're hurting the very people you want to help. I was doing a town hall in inner city Roanoke at a urban church in which the constituents were so upset by what they have seen as a breakdown of public safety and law and order. As one constituent said, we have a joke in our neighborhood. They're in by 9 and they're out by 5. Why is that? And I had to explain that one of the previous governors changed the presumption on bail in Virginia. That made it that much easier if you're arrested to be back on the street. That may have been well-intentioned. I don't doubt their intentions. But the end result is you're having a lot of Virginians that are living and operating in fear. And so my only adage to you, and my only plea for anybody who goes into government, is there needs to be a sense of humility that no, your intentions aren't what's going to matter. It's going to have to be the results of what you are pushing. And have that sense of humility. When I served in the House of Delegates, my 3-part test was, for any bill was, what is the problem you're trying to solve? If you can't tell me what the problem is, that's a problem. Does this actually solve the problem? And the third is, what's the unintended consequences? It's the unintended consequences that's sometimes rarely considered by those that are in government. And that would be my plea for anybody who thinks about going into government. Have that mindset where you're never afraid to look and say, you know what? This may be well-intentioned, but this is hurting people, and we're going to shift course.
If someone hears that as a code of law and order, a call for greater law and order, let me just push back and ask you to clarify about 2 different levels of the criminal justice system. Is there police abuse? And is there, for example, excessive prosecutorial discretion? Should we also worry when the criminal justice system does, quote unquote, crack down? Or
Well, yeah, I mean, listen, I just told a story about a family member that got abused by the police. And as I pointed out before, the only individuals in our society that have a monopoly on the use of violence, with very, very few exceptions, are police. So we should hold them to an incredibly high standard. But the reality is the vast, vast majority of officers do an incredibly difficult job. If you ever get an opportunity, and I've done this before in Stafford, they have a training simulation. One of my staffers said it was the best Xbox 360 game they've ever done. It was a 360 simulation. And you have a sidearm Glock as an officer. And it's 360, and they trace every single bullet that you fire. And they could run you through simulation after simulation. Some of them are horrific, like the Aurora mass shooting, trying to ascertain who is the defendant, who's the victim. But the ones that got me were the traffic stops, of how often and how fast these things happen, and the split decisions you have to make. It was eye-opening. So you should hold officers, though, at an incredibly high standard. But most officers are doing a very, very difficult job under incredibly difficult situations. And I will tell you, when I talk to individuals, overwhelmingly that are the victims of crime, they're looking for more police, not less. Right? They don't want it to get cops off the streets. So I think that's important to realize as well. It's the hardest job in America because I go to work, I put on a coat and tie, and they go to work and they put on a bulletproof vest. And I do this kind of anecdotal question when I meet with law enforcement roundtable. I ask them this question: how many of you all are the children, grandchildren, or siblings of those in law enforcement? And inevitably, about 30 to 40% will raise their hand. Usually at least a third, sometimes it's half. And then I ask a follow-up question. How many of you all would advise your own children to go into law enforcement? And every hand that's raised will drop. And so that should tell you something about and when I ask them why, don't feel valued, too stressful of a job. As one officer said, I joined law enforcement because I was bullied in high school. And then I joined the police force and I was told by so many loud voices on social media that somehow I was the bad guy, that I was the bully. That's remarkable. They're bad cops, hold them accountable and prosecute their rear ends. But also recognize there's a heck of a lot of good cops that do a hard job.
these issues obviously can be politicized. These things can also become the basis of sort of cross-aisle cooperation. You and Speaker Don Scott found a way to cooperate on policies to combat gun crimes. Can you sort of describe how the two of you found a way to common ground on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've known Don a long time. I think he has a remarkable life story, where he came from, and he could tell it much more eloquently than I have. But Don and I may disagree on a lot philosophically, but we personally get along very, very well. And he rightly was concerned about rising crime in his home area of Portsmouth, and so it was an initiative that our office launched, and to his credit, he came alongside and was willing to both support it and make sure that it remained in the budget, something called Operation Ceasefire. So we targeted 13 cities, and it's 3 components. It's prevention, intervention, and prosecution. So on the prevention side, it is a flood of programs aimed at mentoring young men. If you talk to those that have previously been in the gang lifestyle and they get out of the gang lifestyle, what they will tell you is they weren't looking to join a gang, right? In that sense. What they were looking for was this, and this is the way think about when you were a young teenager. You have this amazing, unbelievable yearning to feel a sense of belonging, right? And they found a sense of belonging. And I talked to a gentleman that has a gang lifestyle ministry, and he said, listen, the best avenues to get young men not to join gang lifestyles is after-school sports, after-school activities, and churches. Well, what were closed for 18 months during COVID? The gangs weren't closed. And so Ceasefire, part of it is a ton of grant money, Boys and Girls Club, Big Homies, a group out of Portsmouth, a lot of investment in mentoring these young men. And then also intervention. So Virginia, luckily, blessedly, has one of the lowest recidivism rates in the country. But one of the things that I've done is I've gone into prisons. I've gone to Red Onion. I've gone to Wallens Ridge. And I met with prison inmates about their desires once they got out. And what I heard over and over again was they were really worried about not being able to find work. But then I would also meet with employers that says, we can't find employees. So we just did one last weekend in Norfolk. We've done one in Richmond and Petersburg. Our returning citizens job fair, right? Our goal should be, you paid your debt to society, we want you to be a productive member. So we had Newport News Shipbuilding and all these employers there. We had over 200 people at Calvary Revival Church in Norfolk with Courtney McBath. It was amazing, the returning citizens job fair, to make sure these individuals, as they're entering back in society, can find hope and dignity. But then it's also prosecution. Remember I talked about that small subset of repeat violent offenders, the 3 to 5%. That commit over 50% of the violent crime. We have assistant attorney generals embedded in our U.S. Attorney's Office to go after these violent repeat offenders to make sure they're not out victimizing more Virginians. And so Ceasefire has lowered crime in all 13 cities. It's been tried. It has lowered crime in all 13 cities. And so one of which is Portsmouth. And so I appreciated Don Scott, Speaker Scott, being able to stand at a press conference he had with sheriffs on both sides of the aisle that also participated to talk about the success, and also for me to thank him for making sure funding for that's kept in the budget. And I appreciate that.
Let's extend that image of that concern with bipartisan policymaking to an issue that just seems incredibly resistant to it. If there has been in my adult life in American politics an issue that's polarizing in 2 different senses of that word, it's abortion. It's polarizing in the sense that it, can drive people apart. It can raise a lot of animosities and be highly emotional. It raises ethical issues and hardly just legal ones or medical ones. It also is polarizing in a second sense. Maybe this is the sense only a political science professor would care about, but it's polarizing in the sense that it tends to sort people into one of 2 camps. You either are for or against. There are not many issues like that where there just doesn't seem to be ways to split the difference or shade it. It's just sort of yes or no, black or white, or however you want to make that kind of sharp distinction. Is that just something we just have to live with forever? That's just the way that issue has to be?
No, because I think you can look at where Europe ended up. All right, and Europe went through. They went through the democratic ballot box to determine this, and if you look at Europe, the countries have some levels of restrictions anywhere from 12 weeks to 18 weeks, right? And so I think what most people have seen, if you look at the polling, is most Americans, they don't feel comfortable with late term, but they don't necessarily want it. So they don't want it up until the moment of birth, but they want to have access. And so most of this is determined at the ballot box, and I think I have much more faith in the American people than maybe the media does. And I think that actually gives a bigger question of one of my biggest gripes when I see how the media covers even some issues is they put everybody where they either have a red jersey or a blue jersey. And if you turn on some of these cable news shows, it's people in a red jersey yelling at the blue jersey and vice versa. The reality is most Americans don't live their life that way. Most Americans, and I pray everybody in this room could say this, most Americans have friendships, deep friendships, with people that think fundamentally differently than they do on some big issues. I think that's really important. And maybe that's different because you're on a college campus and you're a bit of a bubble. But out in the real world, most people have people they work with, they worship with, they have neighborhood barbecues with, that just think differently than they do. And that's amazing. I think that's fantastic. I think that's some of the healthiest things in the world. I mean, I had dear friends that I continue to maintain friendships with in law school that I don't know if they even voted for me. I hope they did, but I've never asked them. But very good friendships that think very, very differently than I do on a host of issues. And I think that's helpful. I've been a long believer that civility is not weakness. And I think that is something that is missing. We have this sense that we think anger is a governing principle. It's not. I like to say you never make good decisions when you're angry. But we are fundamentally a very decent and noble people. There is not a country on the planet that gives the amount of volunteer hours as Americans do. Do you know that? Not even close. Or to charity, per capita or raw. There's not a country on the planet that gives the amount of money to charity as Americans. And I remember a wise old Marine telling me this. He said, if you go to Arlington National Cemetery and you walk among those headstones and those crosses and those stars of David's, you know what you don't see? You don't see an R or a D next to anyone's name. In other words, somebody that maybe thinks differently than you politically has given their last full measure of devotion to this remarkable country. So somebody who thinks differently than you politically is not your enemy. And here's the other thing. And some people here really may want to consume MSNBC or Fox or some of these left-wing or right-wing blogs. Most Americans don't. I think the peak viewership for cable news is one of the Fox News shows averages about 3.8 million viewers a night in a nation of 300 plus million, right? So most Americans, rightly so, are not obsessed with Washington, D.C. I think that is one of the healthiest things in our country. And one of my favorite stories I love to share, if I could share it, that shows how different we are. And it dates back to who we are as a people. Does anybody here know who Alexis de Tocqueville is? Good, thank goodness. So if you know his story, the King of France is trying to figure out what makes America tick, right? We're booming. We are exploding economically, laying down railroad tracks everywhere. And they're trying to figure out what makes America tick, because we all thought America was going to fail, right? So they send de Tocqueville to figure out what makes America. And de Tocqueville thought, well, if I was going to go to England, to figure out England, I'd go to London. Russia, I'd go to Moscow. I'm going to go to Washington. And he sails across the Atlantic, and he shows up, and what happens when he shows up in Washington? Muddy streets, there's nothing there. And he realized, okay, for me to understand America, I have to go see America. And he did his grand tour, which ended up being a democracy in America, which, by the way, is one of the most damning indictments on slavery you will ever read. On how in the North, they had an entrepreneurial class, and economically, they were so much more wealthier than the South, because in the South, they were trying to create a horrific slave-based feudal system that had robbed innovation, right? But he went around the country, and he made this a remarkable observation about Americans' uniqueness. He said Americans, they're incredibly both, they're this amazing dual coin. They're both incredibly individualistic. They want to worship God however the heck they want to worship God. They want to criticize their government all day long. But they're also very communally oriented. Their church or their synagogue is the center of their universe. They don't want to necessarily wait for Washington to fix problems. They're going to fix problems. And he said America is great because America is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, she will cease to be great. And I was thinking of the Tocqueville story, where there's a great story of I listened to a lot of podcasts. It was a story of an Indian immigrant that had brought his parents to America for the first time. And he was picking them up at the airport. And he thought, what are they going to be most impressed about America? Right? He thought it'd be our skyscrapers or shopping malls. And he picks them up, and they're driving away from the airport, and they see a sign from a local Rotary Club that says "Adopt a Highway," and his parents are just befuddled. What is this club that owns this highway? What do you mean? What's this Adopt a Highway sign? Well, they don't own it. Well, do they rent it? No, they don't rent it. Well, do they charge a toll? No, they don't charge a toll. Well, what does Adopt a Highway mean? Well, and what is this Rotary Club? What's a civic organization? And once or twice a month, they go out on the side of the road on this stretch of the highway and they pick up trash. Do they get paid for that? No. Do they get their taxes cut because of it? No. Why in the world would they do this? And his son just pondered. I mean, they were just bewildered by why would anybody do this? And he said, because they're Americans. That's what they do. They see there's a problem, and they solve the problem. Which reminds me of one of my favorite Winston Churchill quotes: Americans always do the right thing after they've exhausted all their options. But that is something unique about us. And I generally think that sometimes we lose sight of that, even with some of our big debates. I think there's a lot more that is unifying than divisive, and we sometimes lose track of that.
You've a couple of times talked about what campus sort of should be all about, the debate and curiosity and so on. So let me ask you two things I could separate into two questions, but I'm going to insist on joining them, so you have to address both. On the one hand, right now, just sort of ripped from the headlines, is a lot of concern about anti-Semitic declarations, statements, et cetera, happening at a number of campuses across the U.S. And that, it's easy to have strong views about that. It's easy to also, it's tempting to revisit the question of what is being taught, what divisive ideas, ideologies, et cetera, are pervasive on campuses. On the other hand, and this is maybe just the tenured professor in me speaking, a few states have entertained the idea of literally trying to ban the teaching of ideologies or frameworks of thinking that are considered divisive, such as critical race theory. And that has raised concerns that, wait a minute, at that point you're actually infringing on academic freedom, you're actually infringing on free speech in doing so. How do we balance these kinds of things?
Well, Plato noted that...
You go straight to Plato?
Right. Well, it's one of my favorite quotes from him, which is the two most important questions for a civilization is who teaches the children and what do they teach them? And I will say, just candidly, if you look at the 18 to 29 demographic, 51% of young people say they support socialism over free markets to organize our economy. Less than a third of young people in the same demographic, 18 to 29, say they have a love of America. Only 1/3 of your generation say they love this country. Some of you may be sitting here thinking, that's exactly right. Got to tell you, as a child of an immigrant, I weep at that. And I will be candid with you, and listen, some people may be upset by this, but people on my staff know I speak my mind. 67% in the same demographic group said that Hamas was justified in slaughtering 1,000 innocent people. The most surreal moment for me as Attorney General was this. About a month after the attack of October 7th, I was invited to go to Israel because a young man had lived in Richmond, was held hostage. He had gone to the music festival There's video of him having shrapnel taking out his arm below the elbow. And they invited myself, the Attorney General of Argentina, the counterterrorism prosecutors in Austria, France, and Germany, who all had hostages as well. The greatest terrorist attack on Americans since 9/11. 22 Americans dead, over a dozen taken hostages. And I got to tell you, this is what was so surreal for me. The day I was only in Israel for 2 days. The first day they put me in a secure room, took away our cell phones, and showed us the GoPro footage.
So just to clarify, this was footage taken by
taken
GoPro
from
cameras.
Hamas terrorists, yes.
That ones who were killed or
The
otherwise
ones that were killed or
yeah.
they recovered. Some of it was from security cameras. And listen, when I was early in my career, I was a prosecutor. I sat through an autopsy. I've been to crime scenes. I've seen a lot of pretty horrific images. Nothing quite prepared me. Nothing quite prepares you to see somebody taking a garden hose and decapitate somebody. Hitler tried to hide what he did. They celebrated it, they recorded it. And I actually told them, I said, you need to release this to the world, and they can't, they won't, because of respect for the families. It was unlike anything I've ever seen. And then the next day I went to Barry, which is one of the kibbutzes that got attacked. And I walked into a little girl's room. She's probably 7 or 8 years old. There was a doll at my feet. She had tried to get away from the attackers by turning the bed on its side. Right next to the bed were bullet holes and blood. Still there. You could still smell the death. And after standing in that little girl's room, 24 hours later, I'm at JFK International Airport waiting for my connecting flight back to Virginia. And I look up at the screen in the waiting room, and there is a television screen of college students that were shouting Hamas slogans and Hamas flags. And I just thought, wow, there's a lot of moral confusion. And it really broke my heart at that. And so how we got here, that so many young people think that the wanton slaughter of innocent people and the rape of a music festival, somehow it's justified to walk down a street with people trapped in their cars and dousing them with gasoline and lighting it on fire while they're still in the car. That's somehow justified? It's not. It never is. And so I have been resolute. You can have our First Amendment. It's a precious thing. Protest it, argue it. I'm not saying you can't, but it has been pretty astonishing to see some of the numbers, and it's pretty remarkable moment, I think. I don't know if that answered your question, but it probably didn't. But
well, and after
it's very
that,
personal for me.
Yeah.
So.
After that, anything is going to be mundane. Why don't I ask you one more? Why don't I ask you one more extremely mundane question, and then turn it over to invite questions from the audience. This might also be near to your heart, although in a very different sense, a much more mundane one. Is there a best way for the Republican Party in the Commonwealth of Virginia to select its candidates for statewide office?
Best way?
Primary,
I mean,
convention, ranked choice voting,
I mean,
et cetera,
they've changed a law that essentially makes it de facto primaries other way, and I do think, I'll never forget a story that was shared with me. One of my best friends back home is a F-18 pilot, and shared with me a story that he'd wanted to participate. This was a couple years ago in a Republican event, and he couldn't because it was a convention they were hosting in Roanoke, I think is where it was, and he was going to be stationed on a carrier. And he was from a state where everything's done by primaries. And he's like, wait, so they value me enough to ask for my vote in the general, but they don't value me enough to, and to fight for their country, but they don't value me enough to participate in how they pick their nominees. And so I think that's generally subtraction, not addition, and but it's pretty much codified now. They basically introduced a law that goes into effect July 1 of this year that it's not impossible in local elections to do something that's not a primary, but it's, I think, incredibly difficult in a statewide. Does that make sense?
Do we want to open it up to Q&A? Do we? Or how long?
One or two questions. Come on,
Yeah.
Ian.
Like 3, but that's a good compromise.
Okay.
Ian never lets me have fun.
Three is the compromise.
Poor Ian.
Three is the compromise
Ian has
between
the
1 and
hardest
2.
job. He has to keep me on schedule.
All right. I'm going to let you run the room. You've done this a lot more than I have.
You've been pounding on your laptop, so.
Yes. So you said today, and I quote, "America is great, America is good, but no nation is perfect." So would you say, in your opinion, what is something America is doing wrong, and if it can be fixed, how do you think we can go about doing that?
Well, I'll give you an example of where America, I think, messed up. And I actually think a lot of countries, not every, but a lot of countries messed up was, I think there will be books written for years at our response to COVID. It was like squeezing the air on a balloon. And so much now that is now considered widely accepted was considered a conspiracy theory or a crank, i.e., this was probably a lab leak. And the fact that you had the government that was pressuring social media sites to censor people, I don't think that's good. And so I would say that, listen, Mark Twain said a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth puts its pants on in the morning. But I have some concerns about government using some of its heavy hand to intervene in some of these spaces to censor voices that maybe they disagree with. And now we look back and we think, well, yeah, it overwhelmingly was most likely a lab leak. And it was this kind of weird, toxic notion. And so I don't think we're perfect. We have messed up. You could just look at what happened after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, where that drone strike killed a whole innocent family of 12 people. Horrific. And so we make horrific mistakes. But we also, I think the beauty about this country and the beauty of freedom as well is that we acknowledge them. America does a lot of introspection. America is always very, very quick at pointing out where we got it wrong. And rightly so, it's how you improve. That also is unusual about us. A lot of countries will never admit it. When was the last time you think Russia admitted they did anything wrong? Give me a break. So, or North Korea or Cuba. So I do worry about that aspect. Censoring voices, I think, it goes against who we are. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to ask, so you spoke about freedom, censorship, and also the need to advocate for human rights and human dignity. And I just wanted to say, in my view, when I see young people across the country and at college campuses saying that they find it unacceptable that the U.S. is complicit in the killing of 15,000 children in Gaza, they're standing up for human rights and human dignity. And when they find it unacceptable that Palestinians are people who have been subjected to the longest ongoing military occupation of the world, 75 years of ethnic cleansing, they're standing up for human rights and human dignity. So my question to you is, why have you been so vocal about your opposition to BDS, which is a nonviolent way to voice opposition? Yeah. It's the most American thing to boycott a country that, according to UN Special Rapporteur, the occupied Palestinian territories, is the reasonable grounds for believe is committing genocide. So my question is, why are you trying to suppress this movement and infringe upon the right of Americans to boycott a foreign country? And why are you trying to paint these students as anti-Semitic when they're fighting for human dignity?
I guess my first question is that why are they not also pining for the release of over 100 hostages that are all right now almost essentially women and children? I think that's the first thing. I also think it's important to go back to Gaza. Israel did exactly what the world begged them to do in 2015. They pulled out of Gaza completely. They turned the keys over to the Gazans and said, you have a chance to build a society. You have a chance to basically become a modern day Mediterranean city. There is so much foreign investment ready to go in. What happened? They pull out of Gaza, right? So the Israelis did not occupy Gaza. What happened when they pulled out? Who took over? Hamas. What do they do every day? Daily Qassam rockets. Do you know what a Qassam rocket is? It's about this big. It's fired daily into Israel. So when I visited Israel in 2014, they took me to a little town called Sderot. And they took me to a playground. There's something unnatural about seeing bomb shelters on a playground. You know how long they have to find shelter? Again, they pulled out, they gave exactly what the world said, land for peace. We're just going to arbitrarily pull out. They even sent the IDF to bulldoze settlers' home and forcibly eject Jews out of Gaza. Said, we are turning this over to you. And then as a result, they got daily rocket fire. And I remember a mom coming up to me at Sderot. And she said, are you American? I said, yes. And so everybody in Israel down all over the country has something called Red Alert. It's an app on your phone. So imagine you're sitting at your table, you're watching a movie, you're out on a date, and all of a sudden you hear what you think of an emergency broadcast. And it happens every day. And she said, I have 2 children, 4 and 2. I have 30 seconds to find shelter. I can only take one a child. Which one do I take? Which one do I leave behind? You will know this once you have kids. It is very, very difficult to get them in and out of car seats. And so the level of trauma that you have as a result. And so what happened when they pulled out of Gaza? Again, they did exactly what the world has asked for. Land for peace. They pulled out of Gaza. The Palestinians elevated Hamas, a known designated terrorist group, whose public statement is they do not believe in a 2-state solution. They want to wipe Israel off the face of the map. So when students are marching and they never call for the hostages release, and they're saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, what they never talk about is the river is the Jordan River, the sea is the Mediterranean, and there are 8 million Jews that live between there. What are you going to do with them? And what are you going to do right now when Hamas turned Gaza, all the concrete that was being sent to Gaza to build Gaza was instead built underground tunnels. The water purification plant that the Israeli government had built for Jewish settlers, they turned it over to the Gazans. What did Hamas do? They torpedoed it. They blew it up. Why? Because we can't allow Gazans to think that this came from Israel. So it is a serious, I'm not saying there's an easy solution, but I would also want these young people, what I'd really like them to see as well, because I've met with Uyghur Muslims, why aren't they marching for the Uyghur Muslims? Why aren't they marching for the Tibetans? What about all these other groups? Why? And we could talk offline about it, but I don't like the fact that A, they're shouting the same slogans Hamas shout, and B, they never once talk about the mass rape of Israeli women, and 3, they never talk about releasing the hostages. I think that's a real problem.
Sorry, yes.
And I think BDS is not a very effective system, and I think it isolates Israel in a way that I don't think is there's a whole separate discussion, but it's not accurate or fair. Go ahead.
Generally, my name's Gregory Brown. I'm a civil rights lawyer. I just want to tell you that we support you. And I'm sitting here with Tom Goldscott, who's one of the victims of anti-Semitism on this campus, on these grounds. We appreciate everything you're doing for the Jewish community. And we're asking you to take a look at this. You walk down the lawn, the signs you see might as well be swastikas. This campus is not safe for him. It's not safe for people like him. And we're asking you, you've been so courageous and so brave. We're asking you to direct your attention to what it's like to be a Jewish student who has to go into hiding on this campus. And we're begging you to direct your attention to this campus specifically. Thanks.
Be honored to do so, and we'll talk. Thank you afterwards.
Thank you.
Is that it?
That's all we're allowed.
Sorry, we'll talk.
One more closing I can give you.
Well, ladies last.
Well, after your statistics about candidates being 29 and not liking the country and feeling that socialism is okay, I think that brings back the second part of your quote from Plato is who's teaching that.
What they're teaching? Well, I mean, this is a kind of an exercise that that I have. In 1980, 20% of the globe lived on less than $2 a day. That's considered starvation level poverty. Does anybody know what that statistic is today, even adjusted for inflation? Anybody know what that percentage is today of the globe that live at starvation level? Anybody? Less than 5%. The greatest eradication of poverty in human history has happened since 1980. 1.2 billion with a B people have lifted out of starvation level poverty. And so here's my little test. Why? Greatest eradication of poverty in human history. What led to that? Thank you. It is a word that is a dirty word, I would probably suspect, on most college campuses. It's because it's countries as diverse as Chile, Singapore, China, South Korea. They did not liberalize their economic system, but they went from state control, top-down control of their economies. And all capitalism is, free market is, you know what it really means? It means I'm going to empower you. I'm going to empower you. I'm going to empower you. It means you have a dream, you have a talent, you can be rewarded for your talent. As Americans, we think, well, that's the way it should be. It's very unique. Throughout most of human history, that's not how it works. If you had a land, you had property, you were supposed to give it to your warlord to protect you. And so a lot of these societies had top-down government control. They think government would create wealth. Well, this is a little test I like to show people. This right here, brought to you by capitalism, that all of y'all have in your phone, is as much computing power as the entire Apollo astronaut program. This used to be 4 square city blocks right here. It would take 4 square city blocks to have the computing power of what this is now you put in your pocket. And I could download any song from any artist within seconds, any book from any author within seconds. I have a barcode app that I can scan if I'm in a store, and it can tell me if I could buy the same product in a 10-mile radius cheaper, right? It could tell me an address of my favorite restaurant in DC and the best way to get there. I could FaceTime with a friend in Dublin. Now take this amazing device that used to be 4 square city blocks that now that you put in your pocket, because it really means it's constantly trying to meet your desires and your demands. Compare this device to the last time you went into a post office or a DMV. Did you feel like they were meeting your demands? Innovation? It's the same system it's been forever. My point is, when you have a monopoly, it takes away both innovation and ingenuity. So why do I trust the free markets to create wealth? It's because we've seen the greatest eradication of poverty in human history in the last 4 decades. And I would argue so many college, but here's the amazing thing. When you do ask that poll of Americans, has global poverty gotten worse or better, the same in the last 4 decades? You know who polls the worst on that question? College-educated youth. Think about that for a second. Greatest eradication of poverty in human history. The people that poll the worst on whether it's gotten better or worse or the same are the people who have college degrees. What does it say about right now what's happening in education? I'll let you all figure that one out. Thank you all. It's been an honor.